This week, we discuss the different approaches to vulnerability management amongst ourselves. As we don't have a guest for that segment, we're going to do a topic on vulnerability management, which is, as you'll find, very timely. Then we jump straight into the enterprise security news, latent AI, Optiv Security launches managed XDR, an intriguing update to Mandiant Advantage, Reversing Labs raises $56 million, Morphisec announces a new incident response service, and more. Then we have back-to-back micro interviews from Black Hat 2021, Carolin Solskär from Detectify, and tjnull from Offensive Security. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. Wide-scale adoption of cloud applications, an increase in remote workers, and expansion of branch offices has rendered the centralized, on-premises security model impractical. Enter Cisco Umbrella. Umbrella now includes secure web gateway, firewall, and cloud access security broker functionality, plus integration with Cisco SD-WAN, all delivered from a single cloud security service. It helps businesses of all sizes secure their network and extend protection to roaming users and branch offices. Security doesn't have to be complicated. Get simple, smart, and powerful security with Cisco Umbrella. Visit securityweekly.com/Cisco Umbrella to learn more. Cybercriminals are using social engineering, loaded with urgency and fear, to successfully prey on victims, your employees, or your customers. Protect your Office 365 email from today's most sophisticated attacks with Barracuda Email Threat Scanner. It's a free tool to help protect your business from these hard-to-detect attacks. The Barracuda Email Threat Scanner uses artificial intelligence to hunt and eliminate Office 365 email threats. Find the cybersecurity threats hiding in your Office 365 email right now. Get your free email threat scan at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. Welcome, everyone, to episode number 238 of Enterprise Security Weekly. Today is August 11th, 2021. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, joined remotely by Mr. Adrian Sanabria. Adrian, welcome.
Hey, should be a fun chat today.
Yes.
Some interesting news today. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely.
Also, Tyler's back.
Yes, Tyler's here. Tyler Shields is here with us as well. Tyler, welcome.
Afternoon, Paul. Thanks for the late addition to this week. I got back from Black Hat Conference last week and glad to be back with you guys.
Sweet. Outstanding. Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through the 8th at the Hilton Lake Buena Vista. We're excited to announce our first round of speakers that includes David Kennedy, Alyssa Miller, O'Shea Bowens, Marina Chiavata, Patrick Cobble, Chris Eng, Eric Escobar, Kevin Johnson, and Justin Kohler. You can visit securityweekly.com/unlocked and register today. Also join us on August 26th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time to learn how to implement cloud security that actually works. This one's sponsored by Tanium, and it will be on August 11th. And really to focus on cloud, how to implement cloud stuff that actually works, which I think is a really good topic. If you missed any of our previous webcasts or technical trainings, of course, you can visit securityweekly.com/on-demand. The topic for today that we're going to discuss is around the different approaches to vulnerability management. I feel like it's been quite a journey. I'm kind of enamored for a couple of reasons with this topic, Adrian and Tyler. One, we're doing a group product review on vulnerability management right now as we speak. We've done a lot of evaluations of open source technologies, and we'll continue marching down the product technologies as well in this space. And I think, we've already learned a lot, even though we're kind of in the middle of it. I also am kind of enamored with, there's old and new problems, both of which I don't think we've really solved, right? I think there's still a challenge of how we identify all the assets that need to be scanned and do asset management correctly and accurately. I also think that another big topic is how we prioritize and remediate. And how we prioritize the remediation are still huge challenges today, not all that dissimilar from 20 plus years ago when we were talking about vulnerability management. Adrian, Tyler, I'll turn over to you for initial thoughts. I kind of think I know where Tyler would go on this.
You know right position. Where I'm going to go. Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think across the board, the biggest problem is knowing what you have. You don't know what you have, you can't fix it. You can't fix vulnerabilities and things you don't know that you have. So for me, cyber asset in the broadest sense of the word is the most important thing when it comes to discovering vulnerabilities. Now, if you understand what you've got, great. Look at it, assess it, look at the current state, look at the events emanating, and look for issues within all of that. But I think for my opinion, it tends to stem into knowing what you have. And then from there, actually we mentioned it in the pre-show discussion that we were off air, a lot of the remediation really comes down to accountability. Without accountability for issues, people won't fix things, right? And so, knowing what you have, accountability on the back end, and then it just comes down to efficiency in the middle and how to figure out ways to make less false positives, lower false negatives, and actual true signal to the output, right? That's the key.
Yeah. It's an interesting... go ahead, Adrian. Sorry, did you have a thought there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much I should talk on this. I'm in danger of not stopping if I start. But certainly, if I'm to pick one thing that really irritates me, it's the lack of innovation that I think we've seen in kind of the traditional network vulnerability scanning space, particularly with what Tyler called out first and foremost is knowing what you have. And these scanners today are just still terrible at asset identification, accurate asset identification. So they'll come up and they'll say, yeah, it's running some form of Linux. But these days, that's not good enough. Like everything's running Linux. Like there's tons of IoT devices. There's, the Google Home devices on my network. The phones on my network are running Linux. It thinks my my Ubiquity devices are Debian servers.
And don't forget, in the cloud with computing and/or containerization, much of that is based on Linux in some capacity. And I think when I talk to it's interesting. It doesn't matter what solution they have for Linux in the enterprise, but when I talk to the vendors that deal with Linux, they all tell the same story of a lot of organizations come to them or they go to them and they ask them, like, do you have Linux? And they're like, no. And they're like, well, okay, you deployed in AWS. And they're like, oh, wait, yeah, we do have Linux.
And there's no excuse for it these days. The reason I'm so harsh about it is my Ubiquity devices, the MAC address is Ubiquity. It's running proprietary Ubiquity services, that literally there's a TCP service or UDP service, I forget what it is, but you can basically ping it and it tells you exactly what device it is, what model, and like the firmware version on it. They couldn't make it easier to correctly identify this device. But for whatever reason, they just haven't kept up, and they're still using, the old ancient, which Nmap still uses, just looking at like TCP timing and sequence numbers and stuff like that to identify the operating system. And to make it worse, when you look at Rumble these days, in just like 18 short months, Rumble has made such huge leaps in improving asset identification. Supposedly, they've got an update coming out where just with an active network scan, they can tell what antivirus you're using on a host. Like they're doing amazing stuff and just, leapfrogging, the other folks who have been in the business, who are public companies, spend tons of money on research and supposed innovation.
Yeah.
And this,
but I think
HD Moore's tiny company is just like passed them overnight.
But I think that's an interesting, different approach, right? That maybe not everyone has realized is that we've historically relied on your vulnerability scanning vendors to do this asset, at least a portion of your asset identification.
True.
We need another project that comes before that to say, how are we going to identify assets and where are we going to look for those? And then when we find them, how do we operationalize it and what do we do with them? Right? That's back to your point, Tyler, right? Someone's got to be accountable for them. If you don't have that process in teams defined, then having a process that finds all your new hosts, like who are you telling about them and what are they supposed to do about them in what time frame?
Yeah, the other thing to think about too when we're talking about assets is when It's one thing to say IP addresses are assets. Great. Okay, we'll nmap, we'll run a Rumble scan, we'll do a whatever scan that looks for IP addresses and hosts, and we map all that. And you should map all that. You should know what's there. But it goes way beyond that, because if you start to think of assets as broader classes of assets, as identities, as repositories, as other things, you start to get a much broader sense of where vulnerabilities can exist. So take, for example, your cloud configuration. Your cloud configuration may have some IP addresses in it that represent some hosts. But literally, if you could get a login to the cloud configuration and look at the configuration from an internal vantage point, you may find vulnerabilities that aren't even attributable to an individual IP address, right?
Yeah.
Permissioning vulnerabilities, things like that. So I think the concept of vulnerability shouldn't be tied to an IP address. I think it should be tied to a broader sense of assets and looking at assets in a much broader way. And I don't think the current scanners do that. I think the current scanners are one piece of it, right?
Agreed.
Knowing what IP addresses you have are one piece of it. And a tool or a system like, if you want to talk open source, Neo4j is fantastic at being a centralized management system that you can pump all of that cyber asset data into and look at the relationships and how things interoperate. It's a free version. Go ahead and do it. Cartography, fantastic. Use it. It's free. But it just takes a little bit of engineering resources to date, and that's why those things haven't been drastically adopted all over the world.
Yeah, we can certainly attest to that on the open source front. Take some engineering to get there.
Yeah.
Which I mean is to be expected. But what I find interesting is when you start to develop policies that you want to enforce, essentially. I don't like using the word enforce, right? But we want to use softer language than that maybe in these discussions. But when I think of the attack vectors and how maybe I want to develop a policy that says, look, for any SaaS-based service that we have, if it can use our single sign-on system, it should. And our single sign-on system should have multi-factor authentication. And then anything else that doesn't support maybe our SSO should also have two-factor. Like so if we use our approach, how do we discover all of the SaaS services that we have and then identify which ones are supported by our single sign-on service and maybe which ones haven't been implemented in our single sign-on service, and then take the ones that aren't and make sure they have two-factor. Like that's a huge project in and of itself.
Yeah, and you're talking one asset class.
Right,
out of
exactly.
hundreds of different asset classes you need to secure. So I think, and I mentioned this before, I think a lot of that has to do with accountability of risk acceptance. It's one thing to design that project you just outlined, and it's fantastic the way you approached it. But what's going to happen when you've got that one tool that's mandatory for the business that doesn't do any kind of 2FA? Are you going to kick the tool out? Are you really going to say, hey, business, you're done. We're not going to do it. You can't. You have to accept that risk, right? And without accountability of vulnerabilities and tracking of them, you'll never accurately accept the risk. You'll just check the box, right? But the reality is somebody needs to be accountable. So if that system gets hacked, this person said, yes, we accept that risk, right? They need accountability. And I think that's the key thing to getting things done.
For sure. It is interesting, back to the network side of it, how Rumble is pretty amazing. And Adrian and I have already tested a bunch of tools for doing everything from asset management to vulnerability management to patch management. And I always come back to Rumble as my source of truth.
I love Rumble.
It's really amazing.
It's a fantastic tool.
So speaking of that, just to kind of outline things here, I don't know if we want to focus on any specific area here, but it might be worth mentioning just how broad vulnerability management is these days.
Absolutely.
Because you could actually look at the phases of a pen test in the past to get an idea of what vulnerability management looked like, because that's typically what you'd be paying a pen tester to go up against. Was and you group your assets into internal, external, which there'd be some overlap because you're essentially looking at the same assets from two different perspectives. But then you'd have OSINT assessments would be common, and that would be done just to make sure that maybe the client's missing some external assets. There's some assets they don't know about, and oftentimes you would find them. And that's its own entirely separate segment from vulnerability management today. That's attack surface discovery, monitoring, management, whatever you want to call it.
Yep.
But then you've got the, a web app assessment would be completely separate, from the internal assessment, the external assessment. A web application's a whole different deal because there's no database of vulnerabilities on your proprietary web application. Those have to be discovered potentially for the first time if you've never had anybody do a pen test against your web app. So any custom code you've written, that's a whole different assessment. And then all the libraries that are getting pulled into that, so AppSec has its own huge chunk of vulnerability management that didn't exist before. And now cloud also does, because it's introduced all these new asset classes. Now S3 buckets are an asset class, and serverless components are an asset class, and containers are an asset class, and code, publicly accessible code repos are an asset class. So as it grows, I think a lot of people haven't kept up with the technology in monitoring this stuff and staying aware of it and being able to discover it.
Yeah, there is an interesting degree of separation that you try and make between your IT assets and your other kind of infrastructure assets, right? We're kind of in the process of that at CRA. Like, okay, what is IT security? And then for the applications that we provide, that's like a totally different thing. We need a different approach, different tools, different processes, and different people are responsible for it.
And then how do you normalize the findings for prioritization across those different styles, right? Cloud, infrastructure, and AppSec. How do you normalize what makes something more risky? Is a cloud vuln more risky than an internal infrastructure vuln versus an AppSec vuln? And then deduplicating them. Do they cascade amongst classes? And I think like some of the vendors like Threadfix, Kenna, others have tried to solve some of this problem. I know Kenna at one point a couple years ago had added a AppSec module to their platform, and now Kenna's, I think, got bought by Cisco, if I recall correctly. So that combination of infrastructure, cloud, because they're going to play within the cloud selection or section of Cisco, plus the AppSec module. How do they go about normalizing it all? That's going to be a big problem as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I am talking to folks who are putting this all into one system, like Kenna or a Brinka or something like that.
Brinka, yep.
Yeah, and I even missed a few. vulnerability disclosure and bug bounties, and then data leak detection are also categories of products and things that are now usually handled by whatever group handles vulnerability management these days.
And I think that's likely the greatest challenge. Is it's often not technically how we find these things or assess the vulnerabilities in them. It's what we do with them once we find them and how we prioritize them in several places, in one place, and getting to the point where someone can actually fix it, right? Has always been the struggle, spending all that time at Tenable. I would say that's probably still today the number one challenge that people have with vulnerability management is, technically we can find all of these things. It's how you build the systems and processes and policies so that the right stuff actually gets fixed in a timely manner. Yeah.
Somebody has to your point earlier, somebody has to own all those processes.
Yep.
And that's one of the nice things about, in the newsletter, we're going to talk about Intrigue getting acquired by Mandiant. And one of the interesting things there, generally the attack surface management category is interesting. But if you look at, Intrigue is open source, kind of the core of what they do is called Intrigue Core, and you can go look at it on GitHub. And really, they're using this huge group of open source applications. Like, there's one tool that does the DNS brute forcing, and another tool that looks for certain DNS vulnerabilities or configuration mistakes and things like that, and on and on and on. Looking for open S3 buckets, looking for data leaks. And traditionally, like when you'd have an OSINT assessment or something like that, there would be pen testers that maybe script all these tools together, but it wasn't until somebody built an enterprise product to do that you could really properly prepare for that kind of thing, without having to just manually find, incorporate, and run all these open source tools. So it's a lot to keep up with. And somebody's got to own that piece.
Yeah, and the ad hoc scanning doesn't scale, obviously, right? Because Adrian, you and I have cobbled some of these tools together and make them work, but if it's not working within a centralized process and in tools to get to the people that can fix the things,
if it's running on Joe's workstation when he thinks to run it, run the command line and maybe paste it into a spreadsheet somewhere like that. Yeah, no, it has to be operationalized like in such a way that it all goes into one place. So again, like a Brinqua or a Kenna, you need some system of record for all that stuff to go into. Maybe it's an Exonius or something like that.
Yeah, so it's interesting.
Jupyter One.
Yeah, Jupyter One would fit, Exonius would fit for sure. So what's interesting to me is, did you guys see that Gartner, I don't know if you saw it, Gartner put out a report a week or two ago. They're calling this market CASM, CAASM, because that's exactly what we need, is another difficult to remember acronym. Cyber Asset Attack, CAASM, Cyber Asset Attack Surface Management. They basically jammed attack surface management with cyber asset management into a single unified market that included Exonius, Jupyter One, Intrigue, Sonray, and a couple of others. Which it's all the stuff we're dancing around. It's the unification of knowing what you have from a cyber asset standpoint, and then using that to understand what your threat landscape looks like. But if you read the wording of the report, it's literally all about cyber asset management, which appears to be the broader, all-encompassing kind of, I guess, version of the definition of that market.
So my initial reaction is the jokes are already starting to form in my mind. Chasm. So I like it from that perspective. My other
like it, but you like it because you can do jokes around it, Adrian?
Yes, I do. But I also don't like it because I really think it should be called external asset management. If we're going to have such a long descriptive.
Why external?
Because it is 100% external right now. None of this is doing, none of these vendors that are really associated with the term attack surface management are doing anything internal at all.
Right, which is why I struggle with the merger of those two terms. 100%.
What they've done is they've further confused it by mixing the two, but then keeping the familiar attack surface management piece. And it should all be asset discovery and asset management, and then broken down into, are you doing internal or external? Because every one of these companies, anybody getting into one of these products is going to be confused up to a certain point to where they realize, oh, this is mapping my internal stuff. Oh, this is mapping my external stuff.
That's right. Yep, I agree completely. That's my struggle. But if you read the report, it reads the way you're defining it, right? It reads as this global view of everything you have, internal, external combined. But the problem is they jam that attack surface management, which comes with the notion of outside in.
Nobody tell Gartner, but could you send me that?
I will not send it to you. I will not send it to you.
Yeah, it's interesting when we think about the different categories and how they're merging. And it comes down to, like, what do you need? So do I need to go find an attack surface management vendor? And then do I need to go find an asset management vendor? And then I have to go find a vulnerability management vendor. And then I have to go find a patching vendor. And how much can there be overlap in those four different categories for me to accomplish my goals? That's part of the challenge.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mentioned the acquisition of Intrigue into Mandiant. So far we haven't seen an acquisition. Risk IQ went to Microsoft, and Expanse went to Palo Alto. So we haven't seen an acquisition by a traditional vulnerability management vendor.
Oh, didn't Rapid7 buy someone? Rapid7 bought one.
Did they?
Yeah.
Did I miss that?
Yeah. Who'd they buy? They bought someone. I think that was the only example that we could come up with.
Insights.
Yes.
Yes, you're correct. They did buy Insights. Okay, I'm wrong. well, at least, and where I was going with this is now with 3 or actually 4, including Insights, this is going to go like CASB. I think CASB vendors popped up, start coming out of stealth, and 3 years later, maybe the majority of the market was acquired, and I think this market's going to go the same way.
Yeah, because I want less vendors, not more.
Yes. It needs to be consolidated. I mean, it's cool if they can import from that tool, but from an overhead and a management perspective, you don't want more security vendors. You want less.
Yeah,
we've been talking about that all year, where the more vendors you have to manage, the more overhead you have, and literally we've seen the studies that say you get a worse security outcome the more vendors you have.
Right. Be interesting to see who those vendors emerge with a more unified platform to accomplish these goals and solve the challenges of essentially what comes down to vulnerability management. And I use the term vulnerability kind of loosely in there. It could be that if I have this particular asset, whether it's in the cloud or whether it's a physical system or whatever it is, just the fact I have that could be a finding and potentially a vulnerability.
Yeah, and they, I hope they're not all separate modules either. Like to me, this is, what a lot of the more mature attack surface monitoring or management vendors are doing, like Psycognito and Rendori and some of those folks, and to an extent, Intrigue and Bit Discovery is going in that direction also. What they're doing can almost replace existing external vulnerability scanning tools already. So this should not be, I should not have to pay extra for this. It should not be an extra module. This is just how external scanning should be done now.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting how there's patch management and vulnerability management. Now those lines are being blurred, which I think is a good thing. I like Qualys' approach to, hey, if we're going to find it, we're going to just help you fix it too, right? I think there's nothing wrong with that approach.
I think the main challenge you run into there is those are generally different groups doing that, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
It comes down to people.
So sometimes it gets tricky. Like who buys the tool? Does it come out of IT's budget or does it come out of, security budget?
Mm-hmm.
But they both need access into it.
Yeah. And what's the difference between patch management and vulnerability management in that respect? If there's a tool that I have an agent that goes on my systems that tells me, hey, you're missing updates, right? It can tell whether those are security or not, and it allows me to manage that. How is that different?
It's the same question as what's the difference between a bug and an application security flaw in your web app?
Right.
The intent of the attacker.
Yeah.
Well, and I think more directly to your question, Paul, it has to do with which piece of software is actually pushing those patches, and where the folks log in, to push a button to make that happen, or where it's fully automated out of. So a lot of it's where the decision is made, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Who has control over that? Does security get to say when the patch goes? Do they get final say? Generally it's going to be the asset owners who are not the security folks.
Right. Yeah, I like to see both teams on the same platform because I think it makes it easier to integrate, maybe not more advanced, but other things such as breach and attack simulation more easily if they're all on the same platform. I like the approach of treating, you're going to treat your IT-based systems similar to the way we treat applications, in that we're going to find stuff, we're going to fix stuff, and then we're going to run simulations. And when those are successful, we're going to fix the gaps that they're finding. I think that's the only way you can be more resilient today, is if you have those processes.
Because then they can be on the same page, and they can be, they can love one another and get along better. And
I agree.
We can have some healing, and we can, sit down, sing, eat lunch together.
Well, and I think it helps with the priority too, because the vuln scanner is going to tell you about everything that you're missing, but the breach and attack is going to go, no, we used these 2 misconfigurations in this vulnerability to accomplish a goal. Let's go fix those things. I think that really helps priority.
Here's to me the most interesting thing about cyber asset management and governance systems like Jupiter One, Exonius, even to a degree Intrigue, and things that were outside in focused, right? What they provide is connectivity between all your assets, the relationships amongst them, but specifically they provide, on the back of all that analysis, context that levels up every part of your cybersecurity program. So the context that comes from knowing what you have and how it all operates levels up incident response and incident handling. It levels up vulnerability management. It levels up compliance, right? It levels up literally any security use case you can imagine via the context you get from those relationships and asset understanding. So that, to me, is what's really exciting about this chasm market.
I really like Vicarious positioned in this mix as well, and to solve this problem, because what they have built is a system that gives me an inventory. Again, I got to know about the stuff, right? And put the agent on it. Tells me what's on that device. It tells me about vulnerabilities. It can patch things, and it can do what they call patchless, right? But it can put in-memory protections for those things. But the lens that they look at vulnerabilities, I thought, was a very novel approach, because they brought together many data points that you may not often consider. And we went through exercises on Paul Security Weekly doing this, right? And it was about, okay, there's a vulnerability in Firefox. Well, how exploitable is it is just one thing, but how many workstations are running it? Who owns those workstations? How often is it used? And it allows you to make smart decisions. If there's something that people are using, it's in the approved list, then we better patch it, or maybe put memory protections around it, or both, right? And I thought their approach was really sound. Now, they're biting off a lot, in the market, right? But I think that's what we need in this space is someone to take on all of these challenges.
Well, you're still going to have different workflows for different things, though, right? Like the CSPM vendors, are kind of going after the the DevOps workflow, and AppSec is going to have a different workflow. Like oftentimes, maybe for security, for just having like a good overall view of things, you want 100% of everything in one place, so you can prioritize. You can look at your general risk, but the people actually, fixing these bugs, making these changes, there's going to be several different workflows, and it's not a bad thing. I don't think you can. I'm not sure if it's ever going to be feasible to create one system that has the workflow for discovering, assigning, and triaging vulnerabilities in all cases.
Yeah, agree. AppSec is a totally different segment in discussion, right?
Yeah, like if you're deploying a container and there's a critical vulnerability in a container, that's part of an automated workflow. Somebody gets a Slack message that, hey, the container didn't go to production, and here's why. Very different, from how you're going to patch a Windows workstation or, a Linux server or something like that in a more traditional IT environment.
Yeah, no, you're right. There is a really big difference there, because I can stop the build in an AppSec sense, but in an IT sense, I can't. There's no breaking of the build process, right? Like Firefox is already deployed. It's already vulnerable. There's nothing else I can do about it but patch it, right?
But when talking about the traditional space, I think one of the questions there is interesting, something I'm unsure of, and that's kind of the order of the workflow, like should we be starting with a network vulnerability scan? Because I've seen some organizations that kind of start with the asset discovery, and then they build that asset software, asset database of what tools and what software they have in their environment, and then they set up a system where they get notified anytime there's a vulnerability related to that software, instead of looking at the results from a vulnerability scan, which tend to be, even sometimes if they're credentialed scans, have a high number of false positives, that you have to dig through. And I wonder which approach is really, and maybe one works better in smaller environments, one works better in larger environments. But I think it's an interesting problem.
For sure. Well, hopefully we provided some answers during this segment for folks and got everyone thinking about it. So coming up, we'll be talking about some ad hoc scanning in some more technical segments, and we'll be reporting back on the results from our vulnerability management testing in the coming weeks. So stay tuned. With that, we're going to take a short break and talk about the enterprise security news for this week. The hybrid workforce is here to stay, and it requires real-time visibility, control, and rapid response of every endpoint, whether it's in the office or home. Tanium offers an endpoint management and security platform built for the most demanding IT environments. Many of the world's largest and most sophisticated organizations, including nearly half of the Fortune 100, rely on Tanium to deliver unmatched endpoint visibility and control. Whether you're preparing for zero trust or protecting your network from supply chain risk, Tanium empowers technology leaders to achieve greater agility, efficiency, and confidence. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Tanium. Let's face it, cyber attackers have the advantage. ExtraHop is on a mission to help you take it back. Regain the upper hand with security that can't be undermined, outsmarted, or compromised. When you don't have to choose between protecting your business and moving it forward, that's security uncompromised. See how it works in the full product demo, free online at securityweekly.com/ExtraHop. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Cyber Risk Alliance, in partnership with InfraGard, has launched the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Benchmark Study. Measure your readiness for ransomware by completing the survey and getting your score. Visit securityweekly.com/CIRB to take the survey. SC Media debuts its all-new SC Digital Experience, fully integrated with Security Weekly podcast content and more. The new site increases the scope and scale of original content resources from editorial staff, contributors, and the far-reaching Cyber Risk Alliance network. Visit scmagazine.com to check out the new look. In the enterprise security news, we already mentioned acquisition or two, right? Funding rounds. Intrigue. Did I get that right?
Intrigue, definitely.
Intrigue, acquired by Mandiant. Jonathan Cran. Congrats, Jonathan, by the way, unofficially.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Great product.
It is.
We tested it. We liked it. We kicked the tires on it. It's good stuff.
Yep. Very good stuff. Hey, Paul.
Yeah.
You want to play some new product Jeopardy?
Yes.
How about I read the press release description, but I'll leave the vendor name and product name blank, and you and Tyler can kind of fill in the blank there.
All right, let's do it.
Ooh, okay.
All right. Blank is the only managed cloud-based next-gen advanced threat detection and response service that ingests data across various layers of technologies to correlate, normalize, enrich, and enable automated responses to malicious activity in real time.
Wow, they hit all the... I mean, they win buzzword bingo this week.
The only one that does all 19 of those things.
Yeah. It could be like a list of probably 50 or 100 vendors. Is it like an XDR play or
no?
It's got
to have threat in the name or ZT in the name.
Paul's closer. Paul's warmer with his guess.
With XDR?
Yeah. Look through our stories.
Is that Palo Alto? I was trying not to cheat.
Nope. It's not Palo Alto. Yep, got it. That is Optiv MXDR.
Yes. What's interesting though is like I had to read the quote from a couple of times from David Martin, because at first I was like, what is he talking about? Then I'm like, actually, if you think about it, like it really does make sense. So it's bringing simplicity, transparency, and automation. Like even just those words are a lot to unpack, but when we think about what a SOC has to do, right, we don't want to overcomplicate things for the SOC. We don't want you'd have to spend too much time, so transparency, digging into finding the actual issues, and we need automation to help bring all that together. So I'm not going to disagree with them on this stuff. It's just kind of interesting how they glommed it into one sentence, right? This was a PR firm or person really having a good day putting all this stuff together. Right?
Optiv said, write it however you need to write it, but it has to have all these words on this list.
Right. And it says, enhancing existing defenses to counter known and emerging threats with confidence and speed. I mean, that's what I want my SOC to do. If you had to jam it into one sentence, I thought that was a pretty fair statement, right? Now, how they do that, in based on the other things in this press release, right, is where we'll do some nitpicking of like how are you doing that and how are you differentiating it from all the other solutions that claim to do basically the same thing.
And what I want Tyler's thoughts on is coming from Optiv. Aren't they competing with partners here by launching this?
It's an interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think a lot of the channel VAR vendors over the years, they're used to flipping boxes, right? That's their lineage. They buy at a discount from Palo Alto or Cisco, whoever, flip the boxes and sell them at a markup, right? And that's always been their model. And I think about 4 or 5 years ago, they were struggling to really figure out how they flip that channel model into a SaaS and cloud native world. And I think what they've come to the realization is that that's essentially an MSSP, right? Providing value added on top of reselling services is an MSSP. So they're leaning into those plays. And if they're going to resell a SaaS product, there's no reason that you can't use them as a channel and resell that SaaS product, which leads it directly into a strong MSSP offering. So I get why they're going where they're going. But yeah, you'll definitely run into some channel conflict, but every company has to deal with that.
Yeah, MSSP could be another topic discussion area that intrigues me at the moment.
Is it worth asking Tyler what his favorite stuff he saw at Black Hat was?
Yeah,
because you're the only one of the three of us that went.
Yeah, nothing. How's that for an answer?
That's an answer. Moving on. That's an answer, though. It's an answer.
Yeah, it is totally an answer. Actually, some of the best stuff I saw was I had coffee with Matt Alderman from CRA. That was one of the best things I saw of the trip. Just getting to meet some cool people. Quite frankly, the show was underwhelming. I don't even think they hit their expected number of 5,000. They may have hit 3,000. It was just a low turnout. There were a handful of small parties that I avoided, and I wasn't too impressed. And I don't know if you guys heard, actually, Reinforce was just canceled yesterday as well. That conference is gone.
Really?
Yeah, they shelved that entire conference now. They've killed it off. So I'm wondering how many conferences we're going to have throughout the remainder of the year, due to the Delta variant and the COVID kicking back up again. As far as I know, Gartner's still live, Forrester's still live, reInvent in December is still live, but at the rate things are canceling, it's tough to tell.
Yeah. Ours are definitely still live.
Yes.
Yeah, InfoSec World and Security Weekly Unlocked. But yeah, it's interesting. It's I never got away to AWS's security conference, but I went to 4 reInvents in a row, and I think, I understand why they did it. Because a third of reInvent was a security conference, and I used to kind of half jokingly tell people that my favorite security conference was AWS reInvent, because security was just such a huge focus there, and easily a third of the vendors on the expo floor were security focused.
It just goes to show you the overinvestment that's happening in cybersecurity in general. You get an idea in cyber, you can get money these days. It doesn't even have to have any kind of grounding in reality.
Or fix anything.
Yeah, yeah. Many of them don't. Many of them just add to the pile of trouble that you have already from your other 20 different tools.
Collection of broken toys.
Still good stuff happening out there. I did like Qualys' announcement of supporting Red Hat Enterprise Linux Core OS and OpenShift. I thought that was a good enterprise play for them. I think we often don't talk about, when we talk about containers, largely we talk about Docker and the various cloud providers. We don't often talk about Red Hat and OpenShift. I'm not sure what the market share kind of difference is, but the fact that Qualys is going to come out and support it means there's probably, my guess, a lot of big Qualys customers that are using that and wanted that feature.
My understanding is
go ahead.
My understanding is the OpenShift stuff is largely adopted by large enterprises that want to have essentially an abstraction layer that they can move containers and workloads between internal, hybrid, and public clouds, all different public clouds, and that's where OpenShift really gives them some leverage.
Yeah, you have to. If you've ever played with OpenShift, it's an absolute beast to troubleshoot. They've really divided out all the different components. And then CoreOS is also kind of designed for this. The whole private cloud concept. But yeah, to me, it would never make sense unless you had a pretty big team to manage it and babysit it.
Yeah, it's it's very IBM too, right? Here's this like massive enterprise, offering that is very specific and requires a lot of resources. Whether you're on their mainframe platform or other platforms are very similar. I mean, computing and technology-wise, outstanding. And I think they're opting for like lower adoption, but large instances of that.
It very much aligns with that. A lot of the mainframe ownership and philosophy that goes along with that. So yeah, it totally makes sense as like a more modern version of the mainframe, that IBM can sell somebody on.
Yeah, and I think, sometimes you can lose sight of the Qualys bought a really awesome container security company called Layered Insight, which we know a lot of the people that were there and some that are maybe still there as well. And that's what gives them this, the opportunity to play in some of these waters.
Right.
ThreatX's API catalog gives enterprise visibility into legitimate, suspicious, and malicious requests by the API. I was enamored with their enhanced visibility into legitimate, rogue, and zombie APIs in production. Like the zombie APIs, the ones you find and like you have to shoot them in the head before they die. Like I thought that was an interesting.
They infect you if they bite you.
Something. What is a zombie?
There's an HTML head tag joke in there somewhere.
Somewhere, right? Like legitimate APIs, okay, the ones I'm using. Rogue APIs, the ones I'm using but I didn't know about before, right? Back to our asset management discussion. Zombie APIs are hanging out there, but no one's using them. Like they're dead, essentially, right?
They're abandoned.
It's gotta be.
Yeah.
They're abandoned and not decommissioned.
And those, for me, would present the most risk. I mean,
sure.
I like the zombie, kind of analogy there, but absolutely those pose the most risk because if no one's watching the API, that could be bad. Like not doing rate limiting or any of the things that could prevent someone from abusing the APIs.
So does anybody know how this? Does anybody know how the ThreatX API catalog actually works?
Yeah,
is it
that was my question.
Or does it scan your endpoints, right?
Right, because
that's what I was going to ask.
Where's your API? I mean, if I think about, I have public APIs, right, that are used by my web application and maybe for other integrations. Then I've got all kinds of backend APIs, and those can be my applications that are running either in containers or Lambda services or cloud native services that are all talking in APIs. How do you gain visibility into all of those, right? Because that's always my concern when we talk about API. It's one thing to go, yeah, like I got a server, it's accessible from the internet, it's got an API, and I got to protect it. But almost more concerning are those ones that are internal to my applications today.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, right? Is it using a reverse proxy model where all inbound APIs go through this kind of central gateway that then fans it out to wherever it needs to go? That's one way of doing it. Or it integrates with whatever internal API catalog systems you already have. You may have 2, 3, 4 of them. Amazon may have one, right? There's different ways that you manage those catalogs, and they could be pulling those assets together into a single view. But either way, I think assets are underrepresented in the AppSec landscape. When I talk to a lot of different enterprises and customers in my daily travels, I rapidly find out that even the most mature AppSec programs generally don't have anything in depth for their APIs. They may hit it with a slightly smart DAS dynamic scanner and say, hey, that's good enough. But in general, they're not cataloging everything, looking for rogue or zombie like these guys are talking about. So I think it's a really interesting add-on to a pretty, if you already have a relatively robust AppSec program.
It'd be interesting if it integrates with API Gateway from Amazon, which
that's what I'm thinking. It must, right? It must be collecting all of API Gateway, MuleSoft, whatever gateways you're using to collect it all. It's got to integrate with all of them. And
that's not going to cover all your APIs, but I think it's certainly, as you said, Tyler, some even mature organizations aren't doing that level of monitoring to go, yeah, I've got API Gateway. Now let's apply some security monitoring and protection perhaps to what's flowing through my API Gateway.
Yeah, it's definitely a gap in pretty much every enterprise I talk to, even the ones that say that they do stuff right.
Yep.
Yeah, I think you're right. Looking at some of their data sheets, that sounds like how they're doing it. And they're not just doing API protection. They're doing bot and DDoS and WAF protection as well.
Oh, interesting. So they're actually injecting. They're probably doing both collection via catalogs as well as injecting via proxy.
Yep. Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
Oh, just going back to Black Hat for a moment. Acunetics had an interesting article talking about some of the things they were observing at Black Hat. And some of the best quotes came from actually Grifter, Neil Weiler. And he, kind of poses the question, like, who's responsible for security when everyone is responsible for security? Back to that accountability thing that we touched on in the previous segment. But it seems to be kind of, for me, one of the highlights from this article, because they talk about, without a definitive answer for whose job is security, we're left to determine what the answer is for our own organizations. And I was given the example, when you put a security control in, who's responsible for maintaining that security control, and not just the technical aspects of it, but the exceptions. And then most importantly, that communication back out to your organization, right? When you look at things like two-factor and patching, and which is some of the things I'm looking at right now, and how do I develop a policy? That's kind of the easier part, right? But how do I make someone responsible for that and give them control and management over, like, making exceptions, not making exceptions, and communicating the importance to the organization, which is often the most difficult part.
Yeah, you don't want it turning into a zombie security control.
Well, that's what happens. It's a great analogy, right? You can say everyone should have two-factor or whatever, but like, who's monitoring that when it isn't the case for all of your domain users?
How many change control and asset management systems have we seen where it's obvious somebody put a ton of effort into it and completely abandoned it the moment they were like reached some project milestone?
Right.
I think really what it comes down to for accountability is whose head goes on the chopping block when something goes wrong. When you approach security accountability in that way, that person really quickly steps up and makes sure that shit gets done.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So do you need a CISO? Is it the CISO?
Not necessarily. They don't need the title. It could be the CEO of the company. Right? And if you don't get it done, you're responsible for it. You've made the exception and you said, hey, I don't have the time to do this. I'm not going to actually execute this. Then that risk is on your head as the accountable party. In that particular example, would be the CEO.
Right.
So they don't have to have a security title at all. Hell, it could be the guy that owns the cloud infrastructure. You're responsible for all security within cloud infrastructure. If we get breached because the S3 bucket's being wide open, you're the guy that gets fired. Well, guess what? I promise you your S3 buckets will be tight because that guy doesn't want that risk. So it always comes down to true ownership of something. If you don't have skin in the game, you're not going to go out of your way to make sure it's done right. Most people won't anyways.
Yeah. It's interesting. Do you deputize like people with the CISO title? Like in your model, Tyler, you're the CTO and deputy CISO, right? Because you gotta have some ownership of the process too.
That's where BISOs come from also, right?
Yeah.
In larger orgs at least.
Harder for smaller organizations, right? That may not have those roles.
Well, it really gets tough when you, as a CEO, say, hey, one IT guy in my org, you're responsible for all of cybersecurity, and it's your head on the line when it goes sideways. And by the way, you get no resources. Yeah. That's the bad scenario.
Yep.
Now you're accountable with no ability to fix anything.
Yes. You hit the nail on the head, Tyler. I like some separation of duties there, like having a CISO as a service or something to kind of offset that scenario, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I've recently started using this terminology of accountability and responsibility. You actually don't have to have both. You can be accountable and not responsible, or you can be responsible and not accountable. And so, in some ways, hey, IT guy, we're going to make you accountable. Oh, you don't have any resources. You have no ability to fix this. Well, then essentially there's no responsible party to actually execute, right? And so you need both facets to have a successful security design, right? You have to have somebody who's accountable for it, whose head's on the chopping block, but somebody who's actually can be responsible and get stuff done.
Yeah, agreed. And that can be a mixture of outsourced and internal resources.
Absolutely,
as well. Yeah. What else we got?
There's a big acquisition. Or not acquisition, merger, actually. Norton, LifeLock, and Avast are merging.
Oh, interesting.
Is it, though?
Is it? Because Norton
that is the question.
Norton came out of Symantec, and Norton LifeLock is just the identity protection piece?
No, I forget how they split it exactly. That's a good question. Part of it went to Broadcom in 2019 when they split that up. But no, I think they still have at least the consumer. I want to say Norton LifeLock was the consumer stuff.
Was that also consumer AV?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, I gotcha.
Yeah, because
that makes more sense in the merger.
I did some research on market share, and Norton LifeLock, as far as commercial AV coverage, is still the biggest, just slightly. Avast and Norton LifeLock are pretty close together, but together they've got about 26% market share. And my sources, not a huge sample size. It's OpSWAT puts out these monthly market share reports. But, the thing there, OpSWAT has a few huge blind spots. One of those is any kind of next-gen AV company.
Right.
So any kind of Carbon Black, Sentinel-1, CrowdStrike, BlackBerry Cylance isn't going to be in there. And also, of course, Microsoft isn't going to be in there. They're not going to have any visibility on Defender usage, which I think has been the real big AV kill in the last not quite 10 years, maybe 5 to 8 years.
Reversing Labs took on $56 million in funding.
Yeah, they did. It's interesting. Reversing Labs has been around since 2009. They got an early investment from In-Q-Tel in 2011, but nothing after that until 2017. So I assume, they were at least partially bootstrapped and pretty self-sufficient. Then it looks like either they wanted to exit or just grow more quickly. They took on a Series A in 2017 and which was a more modest one, and now $56 million is a decent sized Series B, brings them to a total of $81 million.
That makes sense with their strategy, though, because I think early on, Reversing Labs was kind of the back end for other security companies' solutions.
Yeah, exactly.
And then they made the pivot where they're like, no, we want enterprises to come to us directly as well. And they've been on that pivot, so it makes sense they'd have to take on more funding for that.
And they just scan billions of files at scale for threats. That's their thing.
But they do a great job with intelligence, though. Like Mario is in his team. They just do an amazing job of giving you awesome intelligence. It's not just like this IP is bad, right? I mean, they're giving you unbelievable intelligence, actually, as to what could be running on your systems.
Yeah, so if you're building a platform or something like that, and you want to be able to, you've got like a file upload feature or something like that, you want to be able to scan those, they're a pretty easy checkbox to say, hey, let's just use Reversing Labs, plug them into our product so we don't have to build it.
Good stuff. What else? Morphisec announces new incident response services as enterprise attacks escalate. Their new IR service assists organizations containing in-progress incidents, reducing damage. So does this mean I need an MSP and MSSP and an incident response company as well?
Yeah, I mean, some of them do it. Some of them don't.
Even more
Tyler.
Services. You're good, man. Even more services to outsource, right? Let's just outsource everything.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Like, what do I outsource? What do I keep in-house? And how do I keep the balance, right? Is it just an offset to my incident response? Or are they, how much responsibility they're taking over?
Yeah, it's interesting. We were talking about it's changing quite a bit because MDR is a lot more hands-on where, traditional MSSP, it's more like, we'll run it for you, but you still, if we find something, we'll report it to you, but IR is on you, and whoever you have on retainer. Right. Then you have to worry about, if I'm going to try and get reimbursed for some of this via my insurance policy, if I'm going to try and submit some of this to my insurance provider, they've got a list of folks I can use for IR, and I've got to use somebody on that list or they're going to decline it. And it's interesting because now that we have FireEye and Mandiant breaking up here, I remember in the early days talking to FireEye, the thing was when they deployed their product out to their customers, the whole thing that led them to acquire Mandiant in the first place is customers would say, oh, okay, your thing found something,
what do we do now?
Mm-hmm. help us fix it. And, they're kind of like, well, we can refer you to somebody, but we don't do that for you.
Right.
It's not a thing that we do. And I think pretty much any company who makes a product that's going to find bad stuff is going to get that question at some point. Hey, do you, yay, we bought your product and it found something bad. Now we trust you. We'd like you to come out and help us fix it.
Mm. Last story that I wanted to cover, risk scoring. I thought they did a good job, and this came from NetSpy, I think, in listing out the various aspects that go into risk. One of the ones I didn't agree with so much was industry comparisons. I've never been really high on industry comparisons. Like, we're in finance. What's everyone else in finance doing? Mm-hmm. I just, as a risk, part of a risk equation didn't make sense. I like how they outlined impact, likelihood, environmental modifiers, temporal modifiers, right? Is it exploit code? How mature is it? That kind of thing. Threat actors, those types of things I think are important to a risk equation. But industry comparisons, I'm not big on that.
Don't worry about what other people are doing. You be the best you.
I subscribe to that theory though. I really do.
My bigger question is, how do you quantify these things? How do you put numbers around, industry comparisons and threat actors? Like, how do you actively say this is a 32% chance of this? And, that's always the gray area when you do these kinds of things.
The answer is fancy math, Tyler.
Yeah. I mean that is literally the those machine learning models. I've actually helped with some of those. I've worked with the data scientists, both directly in a company I was working for when I was back at NopSec, and indirectly, chatting with the folks at Kenna Security over the last decade.
And did you find the output reasonable? Did you find the output to be, hey, this makes sense and is within the ballpark of sanity?
The output is reasonable. The input is not. There was a huge input output problem, and it's interesting because for a long time, ExploitDB was one of the key pieces of that. Because they're looking to see if an exploit exists for a given vulnerability, and ExploitDB was just a dumping ground. You'd have just a bit of Python that would tell you if you're vulnerable, and because it existed on ExploitDB, they would say, okay, an exploit exists. So there was no validation of whether it was actually an exploit or whether the exploit worked reliably. But that's been cleaned up. I went to ExploitDB the other day, and it looks like they went through a huge cleanup, and now it looks much more accurate. For a long time, but you could fix that with waiting, so most folks wised up pretty quickly and would start to put more weight on Metasploit over things like ExploitDB that are, where there's little quality control until recently, apparently.
So I think probability is, somewhat objective, right? What you're talking about is probability of exploit with regards to, hey, if something exists, right?
Well, first of all, does it exist? Does it work? And then are we actually, threat intel? Are we actually seeing it be used by malware that's out in the wild and causing?
And that feels quantifiable. That feels reasonable, right? But then when you start to say, well, what's the impact, risk impact, right? Because we all know risk equals probability times loss, right? What's the loss? What's the potential loss? That's so arbitrary.
And that has to come from inside.
Yep.
You've got to put, the asset criticality score on, that has to be, that's the customization tax, that falls on the customer to do that bit.
Yeah, we're both analysts. We both know that we can make numbers be whatever we want them to be.
It's just very true. Very true. Well, that's the news for this week. Next up, micro interviews from Black Hat 2021. Stay tuned.